Hi, this is Ashley Burchett with the Writing Center at Southeastern, and today we will be examining how to write with sources, an essential skill for writers who desire to write with clarity and grace while placing significant value on ethical representation and citation. Writers frame quotations of sources and summaries or paraphrases of sources, integrating references into their paragraphs using 4 formal I moves. First, writers introduce a given source, possibly including a phrase about the author's role or relevance as appropriate. Second, writers integrate their source by selecting a specific colorful present tense verb and proper punctuation. Third, writers have the responsibility for citing the source in use following their discipline-specific conventions for citation. Finally, writers interpret their source. If a passage is worth quoting, it is worth interpreting in a way that supports the writer's topic sentence and/or thesis statement. Let's examine the first move writers make when writing with sources, introducing the source. When mentioning an author for the first time, writers spell out his or her name in full just as it appears in the source. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. When mentioning an author for the first time, do so without mentioning titles. However, consider possibly including a phrase about the author's role or relevance as appropriate for readers. Then, in all subsequent references, writers use only author's last name, for example, King. For further information about referencing an author, please see Turabian, A Manual for Writers 24.2.1. When including a paraphrase, summary, or direct quotation, writers will prepare their audience for the source with introductory words called a signal phrase. A signal phrase usually names the author of the source and often provides some context. It commonly appears before the source material. To vary sentence structure, writers may decide to interrupt source material with a signal phrase or place the signal phrase after their paraphrase, summary, or direct quotation. A few model examples to consider show how to include a signal phrase before the source material, how to interrupt the source material with a signal phrase, and finally, how to include signal phrases after the source material. When writing a signal phrase, choose a verb that is appropriate for the way you are using the source. Are you providing background, explaining a concept, supporting a claim, lending authority, or refuting a belief? This chart provides a list of verbs that are commonly used in signal phrases. Refer to Rules for Writers 58B for more information about signal phrases. The second formal I move involves integrating a source. When using sources, it is imperative to incorporate or integrate quotations from those sources seamlessly into your text. A quotation never stands alone but is always connected to the writer's own sentence. For a quotation that has 4 or fewer lines of text, writers can connect quotations to their own sentences in 2 ways. First, a writer can drop in the quotation to his or her text, an acceptable but somewhat artless method. Writing handbooks advise avoiding the generic says verb and choosing colorful verbs instead. To accomplish this drop-in technique, writers can introduce the quotation in these ways. Second, a writer can weave in the quotation to his or her text, a more stylistic and graceful method of integration. This example illustrates 3 principles to consider when weaving in a quotation to your text. First, notice the ellipsis points used. Writers can shorten and modify quotations to complement the syntax of their sentence by indicating this shortening or modification with ellipsis points. Next, notice the brackets included. Writers can add a word or emphasize a word or words with the italics, bolding, and underlining, but any modification must be indicated with brackets after the modified portion of the quotation. Finally, note the capitalization. When weaving in a quotation to your sentence, do not capitalize the beginning word of the quotation or punctuate it if it disrupts the syntax of your sentence. Punctuation is usually not necessary in those instances either. However, for both this method and the drop-in method, if the beginning word of the original quotation was capitalized, do the same with the quotation in your own sentence as well as adding any necessary introductory punctuation. When using either of these techniques, a writer must understand what the quotation does in relation to his or her text. Does the quotation introduce, explain, assert, question, disagree? Understanding a quotation's role in his or her text then helps the writer to pick the best verb to introduce it when utilizing the drop-in method, or when weaving in a quotation to one's text by providing a longer introduction phrase or clause. If a writer repeats just a few words from a source, he or she may then have to treat those words as quotations. If they are words that anyone might use, treat them as your own. But if they are strikingly original or especially important keywords in a source's argument, put them in quotation marks and cite their source. For example, note the bolded words in this quotation from Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. These are words that a writer would need to place in quotation marks and attribute to Diamond in the citation because these words are specific to Diamond's argument. However, the italicized words in the quotation are not. Anyone might use these words, so they would need no quotation marks or citation by the writer using this source. Once you cite keywords from a source, you do not need to provide citation or quotation marks if you use the words again in your writing. For a quotation of 5 or more lines of text, writers can connect the quotation to their own sentence by formatting the quotation in block style. Depending on the style guide a writer uses, block quotations are generally formatted with single-space lines, as the CMS Trabian example illustrates. They are also indented with no beginning or ending punctuation marks. Our example shows the formatting as described and also illustrates how the writer wove the block quotation into the structure of her sentence, allowing it to complete the grammar of her introductory clause and punctuating it with a colon. The source citation is located after the end punctuation, here with a footnote. Consult your local guidelines for alternative formatting of block quotations. Third, writers must recognize their responsibility to their audience to cite their sources fairly, accurately, and correctly. From ethos to endnote, credibility begins and ends with the choices a writer makes throughout the writing process. It is the responsibility of writers to build credibility with their audience in order to communicate most effectively and clearly. When citing one's sources, a writer should consider these questions to be certain that the sources chosen build credibility with their audience. First, which sources inform, support, or extend your argument? Second, have you varied the function of sources to provide background, to explain concepts, to lend authority, and to anticipate counterarguments? Third, do you use signal phrases to indicate these functions? Fourth, do you explain how your sources support your argument? Fifth, do you connect and analyze sources in your own voice? Sixth, is your own argument easy to identify and to understand with or without your sources? And finally, have you provided proper citation of your sources according to your discipline-specific conventions? Finally, the fourth I move asks writers to interpret their source. Synthesizing one's sources creates a significant payoff for both a writer and his or her audience. By synthesizing one's sources, a writer creates a literary conversation, positioning the voices from his or her sources in direct conversation with each other and with the writer's own voice. This conversation additionally assumes a diverse, engaged audience whose voices also engage in the literary conversation by helping the writer determine which questions to address and which biases to avoid. Second, by synthesizing one's sources, a writer shows how sources and their ideas relate to other sources and their ideas by connecting and analyzing the ideas in the context of the writer's argument. The sources a writer chooses to include in his or her paper should show connection, contrast, disagreement, etc. to the audience, relating one source's ideas and arguments to another source's ideas and argument, cultivating the conversation. Finally, writers show support for their argument by synthesizing sources in a way that gives emphasis to their own writing and argument. Writers do not simply string quotations together or allow their sources to overwhelm their writing. Thus, it is crucial to remember to follow your quotations with your own words and to conclude paragraphs with your own words. By doing so, a writer shows voice and control over the quotation and the argument as a whole. For more information concerning synthesizing sources, refer to Rules for Writers 58C. A few final points of consideration for writing with sources include punctuating quotations, avoiding plagiarism, and taking notes. Punctuating quotations correctly is a key step in properly using sources. To accomplish this step, consider 3 principles for using punctuation with quotation marks. First, if the quotation ends in a period, comma, semicolon, or colon, replace it with the punctuation you need in your own sentence. Don't forget that periods and commas are located before the quotation mark, as this example illustrates. Also, question marks, colons, and semicolons are located after the quotation mark, as these three examples show. The second principle to consider when punctuating quotations mentions that if the quotation ends with a question mark or exclamation point and your punctuation is a period or comma, drop your punctuation and put the question mark before the quotation mark. To revisit our previous example, notice how the question mark is outside the quotation mark because the sentence is a question and quotes a question. But this sentence illustrates the second principle by showing the question mark now located within the quotation marks instead of after, since this sentence is a statement that quotes a question. Finally, consider this third principle when punctuating sources. If you use quotation marks inside a quotation, put your comma or period before both of the marks, as this example illustrates. In Appendix 2 of Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace, Joseph M. Williams asserts the responsibility of the writer to remember your readers and the choices you make with them in mind. Not what you must do to follow the rules, but what you can do to assure readers that you have dealt with your sources accurately and fairly. One way to cultivate that responsibility when using sources is to avoid the serious issue of plagiarism. Plagiarism is costly for a writer's credibility, and its occurrence should not be taken lightly. To avoid plagiarism, note 3 principles expected when using sources properly. First, when quoting exact words from a source, cite the source and page number or numbers and put quoted words within quotation marks, or situate in a block quotation if 5 or more lines are quoted. Second, when quoting an idea or method from a source, always cite the source and cite page numbers if the idea or method is found in a section of the source and not throughout the entire source. Third, when paraphrasing a quotation from a source, cite the source and page number or numbers. No quotation marks are necessary, but the paraphrase must be written in your own words in order not to qualify as plagiarism. Plagiarism can also occur accidentally as a result of poor note-taking from a writer's chosen sources. Consider these 4 suggestions for good note-taking when using sources. First, strive to record bibliographical information the first time you touch a source. Developing a system for recording this information is helpful for consistency and accuracy. A helpful practice can include keeping a separate Word document open, just for recording source information, while you do research for your paper. It is helpful to even begin drafting an annotated bibliography at this point in the writing process. Second, record quotations exactly. Copy quotations sentence for sentence, word for word, comma for comma, and so on. Adding these quotations to your separate Word document under each bibliographic entry will help you develop your annotated bibliography. Third, mark quotations and paraphrases unambiguously as the words of others. Do not allow yourself the opportunity to think later on in the writing process that a quotation from a source is your own. Highlight, underline, bold, italicize to distinguish a quotation from a source from your own writing. Finally, don't paraphrase quotations from sources too closely. The second sentence is plagiarized because the writer paraphrases too closely by merely providing synonyms for words in the original quotation. The final sentence accurately communicates the original quotation in the writer's own words. To find out more about writing with sources, check out the resource referenced in this video as well as these additional resources. For further aid with research writing, please explore our channel to find more instructional videos like this one. This has been Ashley Burchett with the Writing Center at Southeastern. Thanks for watching.